this is going to be a great opportunity for me to get to know you more, because you're someone that I'm so happy I do know. And we obviously met at Primal Gathering. I knew immediately, I was like, yeah, can't wait to get her behind the mic. But also, I guess as time's gone on, it's like we haven't seen each other that much, but I do feel like a deep gratitude and like respect for you, and also a little bit of fear. A little bit of fear. Yeah, you have this, because you have this, maybe I don't know, fear powerful women. Maybe there's something within that I need to understand. But like, I do see you as like a really powerful force, and you have this look, and I'm like, wow, there's loads, like there's fire there, you know. And I'm sure you've maybe had that before, but it's a powerful force, and that's potentially, I'm sure we'll get into, and that's what's guiding you in a way of like this need for, not need, but like a want for change, maybe.
Absolutely.
And it drives a lot of your work, which, yes, I can't wait to get into. But yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. And I know it's taken a while for us to actually get to this
There's
point.
been some push and pull, hasn't there?
Yeah.
You were like all in, and then I was kind of not, and then I'm all in.
I should have just gone straight after the gathering. I think I was just so withered at that point. I was like,
You're withered.
But I'm glad to be here, and also now, you know, it's taken time to digest and reflect on all the things that made that experience so wholesome and nourishing. And as we now move into the next year, which has come so quickly, it's kind of staggering, crazy.
It is. Yeah, it's imminent, the next year. And the next gathering will be imminent as well. So I'm sure there's a lot of work to do. But we'll get into that. I think my first question for you is, what is a regenerative culture designer? Because I read that and I'm like, okay, what even is that? How do you define that? You design culture in a regenerative way.
Yeah, I mean, so when I speak about regeneration, I always start with the sense of, you know, regeneration is the humility to know that we don't know what regeneration looks like in practice, but we share a North Star of putting life at the center of our decisions and our actions. So it requires a reevaluation of everything at every moment and every point, which feels maybe a little bit challenging to swallow as a concept. And to be a regenerative culture designer means to be open to live with the questions, as Daniel Christian Wall, you know, shares quite in his really beautiful book about redesigning regenerative cultures. It's asking, do these systems that we have in place support life, nourish life, fulfill, respect, care for, or do they extract, oppress, limit, diminish, take advantage of life? And if you take a deeper look into the processes that we have in place, for example, the way that we govern, the way that we communicate, the way that we even pay people, our business models, etc., what you'll come to notice, the deeper you ask these questions, the bigger the requirement there is to reevaluate the way that we do things. And our research and development model of what a regenerative culture looks like is one that is resilient, inclusive, and cooperative in nature. And that comes through empowered participation, which essentially means creating contexts and spaces for multiple voices to be heard, in order to collectively think about these questions together without necessarily jumping to a solution or an answer, which is our natural tendency in the world that we live today, and being with the complexity, because life is complex. Living systems are complex and very interdependent. However, the cultures that we've built are quite reductionist in nature and quite siloed. And that hasn't been working well for us. So it's a very long way of saying a regenerative culture designer is essentially an approach to reevaluating everything that's in place whilst asking a question of, does this serve life or diminish? And if we recognize that our processes are diminishing or extractive, etc., that we hold that complexity and try to find better alternatives which makes, working in your day-to-day sometimes more challenging. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to reconsider and adapt and change and work with the emergent. But for me, has always felt like a much more authentic and real method and practice to, working in our day-to-day, living in our day-to-day, relating in our day-to-day, something that is real and actually reflective of what is alive in the moment, as opposed to something that feels safe and constricted and controlled, which isn't actually necessarily representative of the way that nature naturally operates. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Does to me. Does to me. It's kind of, it's rejecting our own nature to be interdependent and not be trying to control everything, because that just doesn't end up with a healthy system. It doesn't. Nothing is in isolation, and the further you get away from, we've understood that as humans, the further we get away from nature, the more sick we become. My question, when did you start asking these big questions? Like, take us back to when this kind of first dropped in. Like, how was that for you? Were you always a deep thinker? I think we all are, but it kind of gets numbed out of us. But it was definitely true for me. Like, I was very sensitive, but that was almost like, it was almost shamed in a way of like, not welcome. It just is kind of thing. And that's like a depressive and repressive energy as well. That's quite normal. Because it's not just is. There's so much has happened in a short space of time, and it requires people to try and understand that why and hold that within the conversations. And it's not easy because it's nuanced, and there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. When do you think that really dropped in for you?
So it's interesting because I was writing about this quite recently, and I'm currently doing a lot of writing, but in secret. And I was... Not anymore. And what I realized is this actually started, I would almost say, through my inception, right? Like me being birthed into the world. I think I naturally grew up in a ex-Soviet Union background where there was an approach of, because I said so, as a means of raising a child. And through my infancy, I noticed quite early on that didn't feel right to me. So I always questioned authority. And there was this kind of sense internally, a level of distrust, as in like, but why? This doesn't really make sense to me. And I wasn't necessarily offered, responses that were based in any sort of level of reason or compassion, other than what I later identified as means of control. But I didn't realize that at the time. And so also in school, I quite regularly not got in trouble in a big way, but things would be shared with me as I would have to obey X, Y, and Z, and I would question it. And just because I was questioned, I'd be sent to the principal's office, which is ironic because I later developed quite a nice and good relationship with my principal, Mr. Baker, because he would ask me, what would happen, and I would share with him, an honest expression of, questioning a rule or dynamic, and he would respond to me with that same kind of kindness and express, yes, well, sometimes adults just... they're older and they need to feel that they're trusted or respected. And so you just need to go along with it. Just go along with it, Nicole. Just take it easy. And so that rapport, that sense of like adult to adult relating with Mr. Baker actually instilled with me a deeper level of self-trust over time. So I think that's where things, the inception point of why is this here and where is this motivated from and where is that coming from? And I think you've probably sensed into it, in relating with others. When you notice something's coming from a place of control and fear, it holds a different energy than one that comes from a place of care, compassion, and softness. And with the softness with softness, there's spaciousness, right? It's here's a suggestion. Let's orientate and try to find something that fits us through mutual reciprocity, as opposed to control, which is I'm saying to do this, and whatever alternative there is, I'm not open to exploring. And that actually can feel like quite restrictive and not really supportive of finding better solutions that are supportive for all.
Yeah, I feel it's like a trauma response. It could be.
Completely.
It's like that kind of stress in the body that manifests in the mind of like just that restrictive energy that it all makes sense in context. It probably was something to do with their upbringing and what was given to them as like, it is this way, or there's only kind of like one way. And it is just that. It's just, it makes sense in how you've learnt to learn and what black and white thinking, you know.
And just to add to that, so that I would say was maybe the piece of where it like emerged from. It began at a much younger age, but then it really surfaced in a deep way, in a way that applies to culture, maybe in the last 5.5 years, through obviously the work that I've been doing, when I came to understand that by putting different processes together, you can actually shift culture to becoming more empathetic. And that initially, really, the crisis that we face, at least in my personal opinion, comes from one of a crisis of empathy, right? That we for whatever reason, we aren't able to look outside of our belly buttons, so to speak, and because of that, it diminishes and actually hurts not only ourselves but our interpersonal relationships and the environmental world. And so the question was, okay, what mechanisms can we put in place to alter and redesign the way that we relate so that we can create more capacity both internally within ourselves and be able to offer something to our external surroundings and respect and nourish the environmental world. And I think that question was posed about 5 years ago with the inception of Primal, and since then has been unstoppable, because once you start asking one question, they just keep it's like a waterfall of questions keep arising. You realize that once you question and reevaluate one thing, almost everything gets put into question, which is both a terrifying experience but also so humbling.
What do you think's at the root of that compassion piece, or that empathy? That there's a lack of that. There's kind of like, we don't feel so greatly for the other, you know. What have you kind of excavated in that world of knowing where that kind of comes from and stems from?
My sense, although I cannot speak for every individual in the world, is that the way, the way that we've modeled our day to day through the means of quite a capitalistic approach is the sense of needing to care for one's immediate needs and survival. So it's, paying your rent, it's your food, it's your children, it's making sure that everything in your immediate surroundings are initially attended to. And often that takes up so much space that people don't have the capacity to really extend further out towards that. There's this level of constantly looking internally to ensure that our bases are covered, and when you don't have much more to offer, how can you be expected to think and have the conscientiousness for your external surroundings, right? You probably experience it yourself. When you're overconsumed and so crazy busy, attending to everything that's left, right, and center, your relationships suffer. You're not able to offer presence. You're not able to offer time, consideration, additional thoughtfulness, which is required to nourish and nurture our relationships. Bear in mind the environmental surroundings, right? If you don't feel like you're caring enough for your immediate basic sense of needs, the time and space, how can you really be able to offer that sense of presence with an oak tree, right, in Hampstead Heath? Why would you notice the litter and feel the pain if you aren't creating enough space to feel the internal pain that is within your own essence and being? And so it's an inside-outside job. The more fulfilled and the time I take to care for myself, it's actually an offering and a gift towards the people nearby my being. And through that love, through being able to share the love within myself, I'm able to offer that out to those I love, and as a consequence also be able to really love the world around me. But if I don't feel that, if I'm in my not enoughness, if I'm in my like self-criticism, constantly looking for what's wrong, how can I see and be able to attend to the beauty that's all around me? It becomes hard. What about you? Can you relate?
Absolutely, yeah. Loads is coming in. I'm thinking, are there like parallels between the amount of people that through capitalism, through that model, there has been a lot of alleviation of poverty and people kind of moving into getting more of their needs met, let's say. Has that produced the kind of world that we have and live in now, that people are starting to go down a more compassionate route and form organisations around the world to actually to tackle these problems? Do you think that kind of goes hand in hand?
For sure. There's definitely a shift in culture today, right? You see that even with the growth of veganism in the last 10 years, right? When the first, let's say in the UK, even 10 years ago, to find a vegan option on the menu just was non-existent, right? But as a consequence of a growing number of people around the world who are educating themselves and feeling that depth of just care for the environment and everything that's happening around it, it became a market need, right? To attend and respond to what is a growing phenomenon. And that's why change is so real change can really be supported by a bottom-up approach when it happens en masse, which is happening. I think when we take a step back and look at things from from a global lens, it's still probably quite a small proportion comparatively to the world at large. However, it is growing, and it's, for better or for worse, also becoming trendy to care. People are demanding authenticity and demanding that, companies and brands be ones of integrity. You have the younger generation that don't want to work for initiatives that are, farce and not embedded within taking care, whether that's social impact or environmental impact, or knowing where the ingredients come from or where materials are sourced for the items or the software, etc., that they're creating. There is a shift and change in that capacity, in that way. And ultimately, we desperately need it. We're getting to a point where now it's like now or never, and we have to join forces and catalyze the astronomical needs that the world, or humanity living on the world, needs for it if we are to continue living here.
Good, very positive. I love it. To answer your question though, I didn't want to avoid it. For me, it rings true that whether it's someone on the street or something that really appeals to me to try and support, I've had resistance to do that because I know I need to come first, and I've known it for a while. So I need to get myself in a position. It might take 5-10 years to be in a position where I can be like, right, I now have the resource, I have the time, I have the capacity and the money to be in the world and actually help people. And I think that's for me has been a sensible approach, rather than spreading myself too thin in terms of trying to immediately help and be there for and contribute so much when I haven't really actually got my shit together. Getting that really type first. And I think that's okay. It's like the maturation process, I think. But yeah, I've definitely noticed that, and it's been actually quite hard at times to know that I've been drawn in a direction to really contribute and really help, but then know that I'll just check my bank balance and I'm like, okay, I need to figure that out first, But it's it's challenging for people because that is a numbing. You start to create habits and situations where you have to just hold that energy in for yourself rather than constantly. And that's maybe we can speak about that. It's a real like the anxiety that creeps in of like how much we're exposed to right now. And someone could just, all right, go on your page and then look at the stuff you're doing and be like, wow, yeah, this isn't that common. Why don't we see this? And then go down many rabbit holes, and before they know it, they've just entered into a whole new other world view, or actually like the way things could be done and are being done, but are not seeing. So much can happen in a short space of time, but it's really, yeah. What practices do you have that, because being in the space that you're in, like, I'd love you to speak to, do you catch yourself just depleted and really pessimistic because you're exposed to so much that's quite shocking? Like when you lean into some statistics on just even biodiversity and how far away we are from like sustainable ecosystems that are actually nourishing us and the environment. How do you rein that in and just know that you're doing your best? And do you have like practices? You said breath work, but like like community maybe is a bit of an antidote, right, to that mind kind of masturbation, almost that mind anxiety of like constantly being exposed to things. Sure.
Would you be open to me responding to something that you shared and then going there
Absolutely,
afterwards? Yeah. So you're talking about contribution, and I think that's something that's interesting. And contribution is different, can mean so many different things. Not everyone needs to have the weight of the world of like, I need to change the world. And I think that in itself is rather paralyzing, right? It feels overwhelming and I need to like contribute and do something big. Contribution can be as little and as simple as planting something in your garden and watering it every day. It can be as simple as offering to be of service and cooking to a friend who's going through a hard time, just because you want to be present for them. In an ashram setting, which is something I spent 10 months living in during the COVID time, the act of service is a muscle that is really healthy to exercise, essentially, how to be of service to something bigger than ourselves. And often what we might find is when we try to flex that muscle or play with that muscle, we realize that we actually gain so much in being of service or having moments of being of service to something larger than ourselves through the sharing, through the offering, through the giving. However, because of the different challenges that we might face, not maybe having that deeper sense of community, for example, to point, maybe feeling out of integrity with self, with others, challenged with discipline, it can feel hard to find the space to be of service. That's why in ashram settings, when people are practicing being of service, it's also an opportunity to notice what comes up. Am I giving too much? Am I not giving enough? And all the stories that can surface as a consequence of just trying to be, or just trying to offer oneself selflessly, right? And so never to, I guess the invitation is not to think that you're not doing enough in terms of contribution, and just acknowledging that by offering, by even, sometimes if someone's buying an Oyster card machine and they don't have cash to put into it because they're a foreigner, and offering them £2, that in itself is a contribution. It's more about how can we keep inviting or looking for opportunities to be selfless, to offer ourselves, because that's the culture, at least I personally believe we need more of that sense of thinking about the whole, not just the one. And now moving on to your next question, you were talking about what kind of practices. So there's actually a page online called I forgot again the platform that we put it on, but it's called Community as a Practice, right? Which is a structural approach to actually what we weave in the Primal Gatherings, also with the guardianship component.
I read it.
And I'm glad you have. And in that document, all those, all the parts of the home are the different elements that I actively try to practice daily, and I absolutely fall short often, right? There are days, of course, where the pessimism cloud surfaces, and there are questions where you feel like the world is falling to pieces, like in the last, month and a half, both environmentally and systemically, and, the atrocities and the genocide and all the things that are still happening today. And you wonder, is anything I am doing, contributing or even worth it? However, on the scale between the helpless and the hopeful, the only way forwards, in order, at least for me personally, it's a swing towards the hopeful, because the helpless makes me disengage, makes me, pessimistic, not really want to contribute, and therefore I contribute to actually the further perpetuating the challenges that we face. So I have to be hopeful, and in navigating or getting up with that lens of, okay, what can we do to support the shift? I need to first internalize those changes myself. So in this metaphor of, building a culture or building a community is similar to a house, the first level and foundation is honesty. And honesty in principle sounds easy, but in practice is hard. First of all, being honest with others. There are so many different nuances in relationships with others. There's power dynamics, there's, validation, there's previous trauma that, shapes the way that we relate to others. But then being honest with oneself actively, at least I find, or have found, was maybe my biggest obstacle. Are my motivations really my motivations? Or actually, are there some subtle shadow bits that I need to focus on and attend to? Doing so and responding to that level of honesty to others and oneself, but with compassion and care, as to be able to be more resilient and adaptable. So that's my practice. One of my practices is, how can I really be honest with myself, and how can I lean in to discomfort to be honest with others? Then the second layer of the house, so imagining honesty is the foundation. The second is integrity. Let's call it the walls of the house that you're building. And integrity is arguably, and I'll ask you in a question what your relationship with integrity is, quite challenging, in the sense of, doing as I say and saying as I do consistently isn't always the easiest thing to do. You might put your alarm on because you want to wake up at 6 a.m. and go for a run, and then you press snooze and you don't do it. Very simple and small things that can prevent us from establishing that integrity first with ourselves, but most of all with others. Because if we fall short with others, even in the smallest and subtlest of ways, as I'm sure you remember with the whole time component, during the gathering, people start to question whether they can really count and rely on you. And thus that requires consistency and commitment and discipline to cultivate. And so a practice, again, that I try and I fall short on, we've experienced that also with trying to plan for this podcast. It's like last minute changes, this, that, and the other, is trying to really own, okay, if I'm deciding to meet a person and I say this time and this place, that I'm actually going to do it. And if I don't think I can offer that level of certainty, to be explicit and honest up front. Sounds simple. And then the third level, if the integrity are the walls and discipline is the roof, to ensure that, when rain falls down, that it doesn't corrupt everything that you've built internally within your integrity with others, is the ability to open your doors. And that's self-initiation and service. So if you're able to establish a deep level of honesty with self and others, create integrity with yourself and the way that you relate to your world and the people you work with in a consistent fashion, so that you acquire discipline, you'll have more capacity to offer and self-initiate where you see gaps in things and be of service, which is selfless in its essence, so that we can build more cultures of love. And I, a practice in that, let's say community household, for example, is just knowing that something's going missing. I need to, self-initiate and move forth and just do something because I want to ensure people around me feel supported and happy. And so I will go out of my way to do, let's use a very basic example of, dishes or taking things out, just because without being necessarily asked to. And that they're all very little things in principle. So people listening to this might be like, yeah, whatever, that's so basic and so minor and little. But actually, I believe big culture shift and change comes from attending to the small elements. And if we can really think and consider and use this framing of, am I really being in integrity by my commitment to meeting a person, then we can basically increase our capacity to do so in a larger way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting because you drew on a aspect of not I and thinking about something bigger, but then the I is really at the center of that, right?
Yeah.
So it's really the dichotomy, if that's the right word, between I and us, and where those boundaries merge, and where that kind of psychological understanding of you, where you're falling out of integrity, but then like with your actions and all that, it's not essentially about you. It's like it is being a part of something bigger, but you're at the center of it, so of course it's about you. Interesting. So where do you think the most people fall short in that framework, in your experience?
It's kind of hard to say.
What's the most challenging aspect of that?
Probably honesty as the first step, right? Being able to be honest about the things that might come with consequences. So in the workplace, being able to speak up to people in positions of power about things that you feel aren't going correctly, or could be improved upon, is something that can really already stagnate the energy in a space, right? And actually impede on the culture as a whole. And if you're not able to be honest about the things that you notice and see, let's say in an organizational environment, then it's really hard to be also in integrity, because already you're out of integrity with what you know needs to shift and change, because you can't communicate it, and then you swallowing it, and therefore resentment builds, and the waterfall starts pouring
on the house. The foundations subside. So knowing that, how do you create the environment to allow more honesty to come?
So there are various methods in the context of Primal Gathering, and also in the work we do with Primal Leadership. We work on using different tools. So authentic relating is a really powerful and amazing tool, which enables people to speak from what is alive in their bodies as a reference of what is happening here and now. So when confronting yourself with a challenge and hearing what your response might be, I could respond to you saying, hearing that, I notice right now in my body slight tension in my shoulders, as there's a part of me that's curious whether anything I'm saying actually is new, interesting, different, and whether it's fulfilling the brief of Chris's podcast, for example.
Thanks for sharing.
And enabling leaders or people who identify as being in positions of power, which can just be a person who catalyzes a project, for example, to be open and available to being challenged, and to make the implicit explicit by saying, I recognize I'm in this position and you might have this opinion of me. However, I want you to feel safe and know that by you expressing your need or your challenges or ways of your ideas to adapt or improve upon these things, you're actually strengthening the ecosystem. And I invite that in. Because if people feel that their opinions and their voices are invited in, and the repercussions and the consequences won't be dire, aka losing their sense of income, for example, or being rejected from the tribe, they'll feel seen, they'll feel heard, they'll have more courage to be honest. You'll create much more biodiverse working environments, for example. Because you'll have, as a leader, for example, you'll have the visibility of what's actually happening in the space. And then you can work to create and embed integrity, because you'll come up with solutions and then experiment with them together and have that sense of walking and approaching things in unison with a common vision.
I remember Zach saying, when everyone was in the mandala barn, and he was like, just talk to the person next to you, like share something, blah blah blah, and then after you kind of swap partners, and then he was like, what assumptions did you make about this person? Share. And everyone's like, oh, for the love of God, how do we? And I think there's something to like skillfully, like, or healthily communicating how I've assumed something about you, because that's the dance of like understanding how I can do this in a skillful manner, like communicate my truth about what assumptions I made without really like going and doing it in a way that's like just messy and like going really personal, or like, and also honoring that they might not be able to hold this in this capacity when we know we're just going to return to the room and maybe not speak again. So like context is a big part of that, right? Of like knowing how far to go, and that comes with practice and like understanding the dynamics and when is right to like go all the way there. That's one thing I definitely play with. It's like, how do I, what to share, sharing circle, how deep to go. It's like, well, I've only got a certain amount of time. So it's really understanding like the context. That's what's helped me. But just practicing it, right? Practicing like the honesty.
How have you been navigating that?
Speaking from my experience and not doing it in a way that is talking about the other person or what I'm experiencing, like being honest about something, but like really relating it back to my experience, because it's true for me. And if it's true for me, like just and just being in circle, being around people that I trust, that's a big thing. It's like the context of the environment we're in. Because it's one thing being honest, but if it's not held or it's not received in a way that doesn't make you want to trust or go there, it can be more stressful, it can be more traumatic even, to be really honest in a situation where it's not going to be seen or heard or held properly. So I think like knowing that is a really big factor. It has been for me for sure.
There's a chicken and egg situation with that though, right?
Go on.
Well, the chicken and egg situation is like, yes, the spaces need to be held and supported in order for people to feel like they can be open and honest. That said, there are also spaces, I mean, when you're starting an approach like that, for example, if you're not necessarily well versed in, say, ecstatic dance circles, or let's call it the festival movement, right? In other different contexts, an approach of that might feel quite messy initially. And so it's arguably, people do need to feel safe, and those who are attempting to hold those spaces also need to admit and have the humility to acknowledge that they might not get those spaces right. However, there is an openness to hearing people's perspectives, because you're right, if you share your truth and it gets just rejected, so much of you will just clamper down and probably not want to share at that depth or in that vulnerable way. That said, it's so important that we still practice doing that to enable and build that sense of cohesion in these environments. For
sure. How do you know if you can trust someone? By trusting them. It's like the only way. And do you trust yourself? I think that's what it comes back to for me. It's like, do I trust myself? Am I standing for this? Do I want to speak the truth when it feels like uncomfortable but right for me to do so? And as long as I'm coming from that place, as long as I trust myself, that makes my life easier. If you don't accept what I'm saying, okay, this isn't my space. Like, with love and gratitude, like I'm not going to be in this space for much longer. So I think it comes back to that. I also, as I said, like, it may be traumatic or stressful. As long as you've got that solid relationship with yourself, like, and speak from that place, like you'll find the spaces. And you're not going to find them if you keep holding back from sharing.
While holding compassion for where the other person is at, right, as well. Because we also have different baselines of our ability to receive, let's say, another person's truth. And if I, as the person who's sharing my truth, recognize that the one I'm sharing my truth with holds a different baseline, but is willing and open for feedback, for example, then I might still attempt to build on that relationship to kind of coach the other person into extending and building out their capacity. I think that's another thing we have to be really mindful of, is that when I hear people say, oh, until you find that circle, it's also really important to act as bridges into different worlds. And that's part of the medicine that we need. Otherwise, we become echo chambers of, those who are living with their hearts in compassion, with other people who are living in their hearts and compassion. But we need more people with these open hearts and deep levels of compassion to go into spaces where, it's quite foreign or unusual for them, so that there's a sense of discomfort that they feel, but an inspiration to move towards that way of moving and navigating the world. And so it's just, I'm putting an asterisk there around that mindfulness, that we can also inspire other people who've never experienced that, who might even reject your level of openness initially, but actually afterwards be inspired by the courage that was required for you to share at that level with them.
Sure. And you might not ever get that feedback or that metric. It might never happen, but it's like something on the podcast. Someone just may never reach out, but you could be changing their life.
Yeah. And
you may never know. So it's just keep on showing up, I think. What do you feel? You mentioned that quite important example that we're in these spaces, we're in the echo chambers, and we're not looking this direction, we're just focused on over here because it's full of joy and happiness, and we're representing something and standing for something that we believe is making the change, is really helping the world and helping people heal. But we don't look over here. I really try and look and focus on that kind of blind spot that when I'm not doing that, when I'm just too engrossed in the love and light over here, and happy in doing that. There's no right and wrong to this, but it's feel if I'm standing for like change or like it influencing in a healthy way, like other people to meet themselves or hold space or create a space that is not exclusive, am I looking in this direction and bridge? And it's like I see it as like the mainstream. Like, what is the mainstream of things? Am I spending too much time in these spaces? Am I spending too much time in Hackney sauna baths with all the hippies? Or, which I did on Monday, go to New Steam Dockland Bath, which is a very like locals and very diverse energy and people, men and women. And Peter, men's work coach, works for Sacred Sons, invited me, and I learned so much about myself in that space. I wouldn't go there all the time. It wouldn't be healthy for me. But I learned a lot because I'm in a space where people just don't get it and they don't understand like what the word sacred means, or like how's that relevant to my day to day, or fascinating conversations. And it's like, can we dip our toes in these spaces more often than not? Because that's where the bridges come, and that's just harder. It's just harder when you're not met constantly with love and eye contact, and like, how does that signal to me of like where I clearly am trying to get acceptance of someone that doesn't accept me, and what that brings up in me. When's that been relevant for you? And you mentioned shadow aspects. Could you give some examples of how you've worked through like the shadow in your own life and how you've been able to kind of transcend or move through it? Or
Yeah, sure. I'll respond first to the echo chamber comment, because I think it's really, really important. And that sense of let's look at nature as an example, right? The sense of biodiversity in order for it to enrich the soil. If we plant monocultures of eucalyptus trees, for example, in Portugal, eucalyptus is a very, let's say, greedy water plant, right? Just from the soil, and incredibly flammable. So when one tree goes on fire, all of the trees quickly go on fire. So if those monocultures weren't monocultures and were instead biodiverse, we wouldn't have the same challenges that we face. So it's so important, but it's not everybody's role. That's another thing to take into mind. But it is important for us to biodiversely explore different coves, contexts, and spaces and places, and recognize that the validation we need, number one, is from ourselves. And the deeper that we're able to accept ourselves enables us, whatever the context or environment, to emanate the compassion, the care, the softness, the way of relating, even communicating, eating, the thoughtfulness that we might encompass in other spaces where maybe people don't necessarily encompass that. Leadership, my personal understanding and vision for it is it's an embodiment. It's not what we speak to. So if you want to lead, you must embody these different principles. Our map is the honesty, integrity, and service map from Primal. Other people have other maps. But I know that my journey towards these principles came because there was a woman called Dada Beer in the ashram that I was staying, who was the living, breathing embodiment of these principles that I've shared with you. And she didn't ever really tell anyone about the things that she was doing for other people. She was actually quite quiet, but always honest, who could count on her. If she agreed to something, she was always there, and it was very selfless, just in general as an individual. And so by the way that she led herself, that inspired me closer to the journey that I've been on and continue to be on as a consequence of one person. So imagining being that one person and sitting in a corporate context, for example. I think we don't realize the level of power that our presence alone can have on our environmental context. And if we did recognize that, we might have more courage to enter those spaces in that way. And there's so much to learn from different worldviews and perspectives, especially the ones that we disagree with. I mean, I love being in rooms with people who disagree with each other. I genuinely adore it because it makes me feel like, wow, this is my little cove, little worldview, and it's getting punctured by a completely different perspective and way of looking at things. And that's so healthy, because if you can sit together with opposing views and still find what connects to you, I mean, that in itself could be a microcosm of the macrocosm in the way that we disagree with each other. We should be allowed, by the way, to disagree with each other, even though the cultures that we are a part of at the moment feel differently, very polarizing and even minimizing if someone has a different opinion. And this makes me think of my grandparents, because even of the Ukraine and Russia war, not to bring too much politics into it, my grandparents married, been together for 40 something plus years, have completely different perspectives on the war. But even so, they do argue with each other about it. There's still common ground in the sense they still share a meal with each other. They'll still go for a walk. They'll still find the things that connect them. But they learn from each other, and they can still not necessarily agree. And I think that is really healthy for life in general. And I love that, for example, with Primal. And I do see Primal as a bridge builder, both in the gathering model, the people who come who've never planted trees in their life before, and also in the leadership model, where we go with, organizations that are, maybe more corporate in the way that they operate with each other, and introduce them to horizontal governance, to authentic relating, to tree planting, etc. And that can open them up in ways that they would never have experienced otherwise. And so I do believe it is a duty in some way, not for everybody, but to embody the values that we wish for the world, to then lead that change and then emanate both the vibration and the way that we wish for the world to orientate by orientating it ourselves in different codes and different places. And you did ask me another question.
You're very good at this.
What, shadows?
Yeah, but like coming back to the questions, you're very like precise. It's legit.
You're talking about shadows that I've personally had to navigate in order to...
Yeah, maybe it feeds into this conversation about disagreeing with people, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. Shadows, I mean, so many. I mean, gosh, being human is there's so many shadows. I shall write you a book, send it to you after the podcast with my list of shadows. I think one of my shadows that I had to navigate quite extensively, starting from a burnout that I encountered in 2015, was in that moment the control. I definitely felt like a need, pre-mindfulness discovery, pre-anything remotely primal or regenerative, the sense of like, if things felt out of control, that I would just I wouldn't really know how to orientate, or I would feel that an experience or opinion that I had needed to be like that was the thing. If I said
approved,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If someone countered something that I had shared, it would lead into an argument. And so I think in my late teen years, early 20s, maybe up until 22, 23, I was quite argumentative. Whereas now I basically don't ever argue. We can disagree, of course, but
there's a difference between a conversation and a discussion, and a disagreement moves into the territory of arguing.
Completely.
It's very different energy.
Yeah, completely. And so I think I went from my way or the highway to how can we discover mutual reciprocity, and what are the requirements in communication in order to attend to that and create for that. And so now my attitude isn't my opinion or what I think is needed is the right way, to probably I don't know what the best way is. And so through empowered participation, through the communication and the space of other opinions and lenses, we might find a better solution and work together to find out what that could be. So I guess I went from being kind of arrogant, to be honest, to embodying maybe a deeper level of humility, which I can't help feel when you work in nature. I think often it's a natural consequence of relating to nature, because you just realize that you are just this little human that is completely held and supported by the natural world.
Beautiful. So when you are having a disagreement with someone, what are the signs that it's not progressing in a way that's healthy? Because I think we can get into this territory, and before we know it, we are arguing, and we're like, God, like, and then we get quite stressed. Let's say I can get quite stressed, and then I'm out of the awareness to understand if it's like a productive conversation or not. It's like it's quite murky. So what are the signs for you? Because you may have, I don't know, do you have a lot of discussions with people where you don't agree in your spaces, and that's really what I gather you're really trying to invoke and bring to the table. So what are the signs where someone, and what do you need from someone to meet you into that discussion, and when you don't get it, it's kind of like, how do you eject in a healthy way, or like just say this isn't going in a way that's productive, you know?
Signs that a conversation is not so-called progressive. I would say probably obvious characters, which is defense, attack, not listening, and total disengagement probably like the four main ones. If you're in defense or attack, there's some level of protection that's surfacing, which means you feel like you're probably
Unsafe.
being attacked,
Scared.
or judged or scared. And then disengagement comes often as a consequence of that just feeling even exacerbated. So if the person doesn't even feel listened to, then they just kind of begin checking out. Obviously, there are the obvious things where raised voices, etc. The way to attend to those, or what I have experienced as positive mechanisms to say, deflate those responses, is first of all tone. So approaching someone with curiosity as opposed to accusation. So I've noticed, Chris, that when you put the tea on, it did X, and I'm curious what your thoughts or reasoning were behind that, giving you an opportunity to share your experience about this teapot situation.
Mm-hmm.
Then that offers me the opportunity to share with you, well, in my experience, or the story that I have in my head, therefore owning my experience, is when you did that, I thought it meant that maybe you were just being British and kind and offering me the tea, but actually didn't really want to. And the way that made me feel was, I don't know, lack of trust, or a little bit uneasy or anxious, or all of the things, which enables you to have visibility on my experience, which also offers us the opportunity to understand whether this curiosity is true or just a story in my head, which hopefully, if people have similar baselines, will lead towards a deeper sense of intimacy and understanding. That's like the most optimal context and situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think when someone feels cornered or attacked, sometimes they can be a little bit unreasonable in the sense they're not really able to attend and receive the information that you share. And for those two circumstances, offering space, so knowing when the time and place is to have the conversation, and also responding with care. So noticing, just want to remind you that I'm not trying to prove anything. It's not about who's right or wrong. I want you to know I value you, that I care for you, that I respect you. I'm just trying to understand something, and maybe through us speaking, we can get better visibility on the dynamics at play, so that we can improve upon our relationship, for example. So curiosity, care, compassion, and space.
Nice. Is that your framework?
No, not until you asked me the question, but maybe it could be.
Yeah, maybe. That's cool. I like that. Obviously, I've read Nonviolent Communication, and he talks about this a lot. And Marshall Rosenberg, believes that there's no situation where two people can't get their needs met. And he has these real life examples where he's got like tribe leaders together and like communicated in a certain way that like results in real understanding of each other. And on paper it's like, wow. And in real life it does work. But when you start to practice it, having 30 years of the habit of like, but you've done this, like you did. And you like come from that place of you needing acknowledgement, and it's like, so you're demanding you to be seen, and there is another way of like getting that need met.
There's also one more thing I did forget, which is a commitment. So a commitment to understanding, right?
Or like, I'm not going anywhere, like reassuring that you're committed.
Well, often in relationships, and I think an element that re-injures our abandonment wounds is, if I communicate X, Y, Z, this person might disengage and I'll never see them again, or this relationship might end, or et cetera, et cetera. So if you voice up front that you're committed to reaching a level of understanding, meaning it's not about who's right or who's wrong, and I value you and I don't want this to impede our relationship but strengthen it, that can really support people's ability to drop in and actually be available and trust in being open and vulnerable with the other person.
Yeah, it's magical. It's quite common for you not to see people again in our culture. Like, you know, it didn't used to be that way. You lived in amongst people and you had some sort of, I see this and experience this a lot in London. There's some stuff that goes on in London just day to day that you just wouldn't get away with anywhere else. It's just, you know, people just like, well, there's the light and dark of this, because people are more accepting of like what they wear and like how they act, because they know they're not trying to prove anything to anyone. But there is a level of like social accountability, or like there's in a local village that you would have, because you have a responsibility. You're gonna need these people, and it's like what we experience in a tribe or in a community for 10 days, and you have accountability to these people to show up. Or you will be, you know, there's going to be energy there that's not going to be nice for you, or that you're going to have to step up a little bit. But yeah, I think that's just a thing of our time. Like, you can have a conversation with someone and know that you could never have to see them again, you know, and that's a real thing for people. So where's the accountability there to like actually, you know, I think we all know the answer to that, but I think it does feed into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it differentiates from building community, right? Which is an investment of time. And I often speak about my relationships like a raised bed in the garden, in the sense that I only have so much, you know, of my plot of land. And, you know, I can plant a tomato here, some potatoes there, some parsnips over here, but I don't have room for every you know, vegetable that's there, and each one requires, you know, water, sunlight, nourishment, attention, songs, all the different things. So there's a commitment there that if you're my friend, I say often, you're my best friend, as in like it's meaningful and we're building something. That's not everyone's attitude, that's not everyone's means of relating. I question whether people secretly all yearn for that level of depth and care, especially tribe and community. I feel very fortunate that, you know, that's something that we have with Primal, and I'm, you know, you also have been in all these different circles as well and probably experience the same. And but it is there is a sadness that I feel with what you've just shared, and I do long for that for the world, this deeper sense of accountability in our relationships, that investment, because it is an investment, and you know, the studies say that the happiest people and the ones that live the longest are the ones that have the, you know, the deepest and longest relationships. Even that documentary Blue Zones that came out says, you know, the same thing. All these centenarians, one thing that they all have in common is this deep sense of relationship and community. And so it is really worthwhile in investing in each other. And it probably comes as a consequence of the things we shared in the beginning, that survival. Yeah, the immediacy of the needs, the taking care, the money, the stress, the food, the education, and it can feel weighty, and because there's this not necessarily the same baseline of acceptance of each other, people feel like they can't be honest about what's going on in their worlds. And so if you cannot be honest about, you know, your situation, your context, your money challenges, your divorce, your etc., then how can you cultivate intimacy and build deeper relationships? And maybe then, of course, the accountability piece withers because you're too afraid of actually investing, because if you invest in those relationships, you have to be seen, and to be seen is risky because it means you could be abandoned and rejected, and that's a wound that extends through the beginning of the ages as humans. If you were rejected from your tribe, you know, you might not survive.
Dead.
Yeah, dead.
It's still there. Uncertainty is unsafety, and being vulnerable is definitely uncertainty within that. Let's talk about Primal. And how has your life changed in the last year? So before, I think last year was the first time in the UK, right?
First in the UK.
Yeah. So how has it changed since it's been in the UK? And maybe you could just paint a little picture. You mentioned it a few times of like, what is the mission of Primal?
Thank you. So Primal's mission is to leave people and places better than how they were found. And the vision is to make essentially every gathering, regardless of context, regenerative in nature. What Primal is, and the description that we're using at the moment now, is a regenerative culture design studio to support both people and organizations to be more resilient, inclusive, and cooperative in nature whilst regenerating the environment. The reason for that is by architecting the right container to support a deeper sense of belonging, and then introducing people to land-based initiatives or experiences. There's a transference of empathy that can then be created, or transference of empathy that then moves towards people's relationship to the natural world. So if I feel loved and I am in love with those that are surrounding me, and I then touch soil for the very first time, or plant a tree, or learn about a vegetable, or I can identify a garlic, or, a beech tree, or learn about bees, then I will intrinsically develop an emotional relationship with the natural world, which is kind of our Trojan horse approach for shifting what we feel is a need for the environmental crisis, because we can throw statistics at people left, right, and center, scare people on our televisions, scream a narrative of oncoming doomism, which we know just leads to further paralysis and depression and disengagement anyway, and hope for change. And from what I've seen in the work that we've done throughout these last 4.5, almost 5 years now, is that when people touch the soil, something shifts and changes. And so, thinking, next 5-10 years, if this model, or when this model rather, because we're already starting to build our program around this, can be replicated in different coves and cultures around the world, people will be able to be introduced to getting to know their local gardeners, getting to know their local artisans, getting to know their local musicians, getting a sense of the landowners who are nearby, and the ability to just touch base with the natural world and be curious and excited about it, right? Instead of permeating this doomism narrative, thinking about or creating the right conditions to actually celebrate nature, commune with nature, love nature, be excited by it, be with it.
Yeah. How do you get people to, care about something they're a part of and is really important? You get them to fall in love with it. Yeah.
So yes, we're in the business of the business or the project.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? Really, when you think about it, it's like we're in the business of getting people more in touch with the thing they're a part of, and they've never lost really connection to, because they depend on it and it depends on them completely. And then in terms of how things have shifted upon coming to the UK, if anything, it's just supported just a deeper knowing that every culture is so different from the other, and that you can have principles that are shared, and this honesty, integrity, and service piece, but related to differently because of their different systems they're a part of. In the UK, you have class, it's a much bigger and more prevalent thread through society here, which maybe inhibits people's ability to be as honest in as fast a pace as, let's say, Portugal, for example. I know we experienced that with the Guardians, remember, on the last night. That really long... we're all drained. Let's have a deep conversation about
everything that was going on. That took 5 days to get to that point in the UK. However, in Portugal, probably on day 2, we would have already been there. And that's not to say that something is better or worse than the other. It's just noticing that, each land has its own vibration and has its own systems in place and its own rituals and its own coping mechanisms, and that we're in some ways a product of our environmental context socially.
Sure.
So that's probably been like the most interesting element, and the deeper sense also of how many cool, amazing local regenerative projects there are all over the country. Is just so exciting. So doing things with our Bees to a Flower initiative, where once a month we gather a group of volunteers and go visit Chris Park with his beekeeping, or no dig gardening in Bristol, or going to Yorkshire. There's every part of the UK has this like really beautiful different flavour, and that's really exciting. Yeah.
Amazing. And the next one is in March. May, sorry. What are the dates?
15th to 19th.
Can you say the venue?
Yeah, it's in Broughton Sanctuary.
Braunton, I think.
I hope I'm saying it
I
correctly.
thought it was Braunton. Broughton.
Broughton.
Yes.
Sanctuary.
In Yorkshire.
In Yorkshire?
Yes, there you go. It's definitely not Yorkshire. Maybe posh. Yorkshire?
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yes, thank you.
It's north. It's the north.
Yeah.
Anything north of London. Yeah, amazing. I mean, God, what to touch upon. I mean, being there for 10 days, the best thing that I really experienced over that time was the kind of, I don't know if you'd call it like the decentralizing or of the kind of social dynamics, but it felt like we were all on a very similar plane. There was no like backstage, or there was no like artist area, or like it was just we were just there, and that was the best thing for me. And what I spoke to people about, I think that was just nice to coexist, to exist with all people, and you end up just having just beautiful conversations, because no one really knows who is who by their wristband or by their thing. So it's just a beautiful element. And when you get people that are on board with that, like they're the people I want to spend the time with, because they understand that it's not about like separation or hierarchy in a unhealthy sense. So yeah, that was a beautiful element to it for sure. But also an experiment, right? It's like not pretending to know the way, but it's like, let's try this, and always have the discussion available, and the check-ins and the safe space to discuss the framework and be the framework, and to lean into our own integrity and stuff. But that's definitely one thing, like pretty much every morning we'd have that space to go within. And since then, I've noticed the difference of being in spaces where I don't get the opportunity. And I'm kind of like, this isn't right or wrong, but I know what I need more. And it's like, I need the space. If we're living together, whether it's a retreat or an event, or if we're living together, I need the space to communicate things that aren't working for me, or that where I'm at, essentially. So yeah, that was powerful. Obviously, in amongst the amazing people that were offering their unique gifts and talents and their work and their voice. And since then, I think it was at Primal that I then started to get more women on the podcast. So it's like a big shift. I think I was just connecting, because talk about echo chambers. I existed in an online space where I connect with loads of men and just inspired by men, and like calling myself to action through that. But it's Primal, like I made so many connections with women, and it was like, right, let's do this. I had like many guests. I had like Sam, storyteller, that I had on the podcast, and
Tasha,
yes, 42 Acres I hadn't been before. So yeah, it gifted so much to me. Anything you want to touch upon?
I mean, it's always so lovely to hear people's experiences, especially like the different components and how that supports. This morning check-in sounds like such a basic principle, but it allows for an undressing. So if you feel like you have an opportunity to kind of undress in front of other people, right? Like people have seen you naked, basically. A deeper sense of intimacy.
That was nakedness, but not in the...
A deeper sense of intimacy surfaces, right? And also trust, because if I know what's happening in your world, then I have visibility, and I can actually trust you more, which is like the irony.
So fascinating, isn't it? It just shines a big light on why that isn't the case in so many scenarios.
Completely. And I imagine that also contributed then into like the strength of the Guardian work, which, for context, the Guardian work in Primal, people might use the word volunteer. We don't use that word, and actually Medicine and Love Jam have now pinched the Guardian, but I love that they have, to be honest, because it's about a certain way of being, that you're acting as guardians of the land, stewarding the space, offering support. And you need each other, right? If you're just checking in and checking out during your shift times, it's a completely different attitude to actually acting as a guardian of a space where you're collectively, holding that container together. And that's what the Guardians are. And not only are they holding the container in terms of, like, of course, helping with the food and the wash and things like that, you're also embodying those character principles of the honesty, the integrity, as in like turning up as and when we say we will, and then the selfless service, right? That component, right? You're practicing all three, and then you're emanating that into the space, which helps hold the space. So that is like, that check-in component will never be compromised, as long as, I'm alive and connected with this project. The second piece, you were talking about this horizontalness, right? The sense of like, you don't have an artist area. And that's something I felt always incredibly passionate about, and also bring into the organization work. Power dynamics are so subtle, but they do really affect the way that we relate to each other. And I don't always think, or my experience is that hasn't always been positive. I love to believe that we are all humans, as in our basic sense, right? And therefore we can relate on every level. I love the fact that we can be eating breakfast, with Faisal, or going for a walk with Farhana Yamin, and then that is accessible to absolutely everyone. That there's no
maybe not Zach Bush. Damn it.
Well, Zach Bush was, he came and he went. But that there's this sense of like, no one is more important than anybody else, right? We all have a right to eat, to sleep, to connect, to be, and that that there's a sense of accessibility in that. And I don't want that. I don't want musicians to feel exclusive and And I think actually in all the years we've done this, the musicians actually receive a lot from it. Like they feel like they can just like hang out, rest. They're not idolized or pedestaled or. There's just a sense of being with wonderful people, and wonderful people being able to, get to know people behind their craft. Because often one's craft is one's craft, but the person behind the craft might actually be a whole different experience, right? And when you're able to see the whole multifaceted person in their essence, there's just, it's a sense of communion, right? It's the sharedness. And I think that's what Primal does really well. It's the sense of unity, the sense of, which sounds maybe a bit hippie, but more a sense of common vision, shared principles, meeting on an equal playing field, and just being with each other because we want to be with each other, not playing too deeply into power dynamics, but also, and I think you witnessed this, making the implicits very explicit, right? When there are subtleties around, let's call it power dynamics, because if we have that awareness of these nuances in the background, we can adapt to enrich our cultures to be more supportive of life as opposed to extractive of it. So yeah, that horizontal governance is a wish that I also have for organizations that are deeply hierarchical, because it goes back to this empowered participation component. If we have a sense of equality in terms of what our contributions are, but we acknowledge that we might have different levels of wisdom, different levels of experience, etc., but that each one is equally valued and respected, so much would shift. in our day-to-day, not even to speak of, you know, the injustices and the judgments and the racism and the, you know, the sexism and etc., 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 that comes as a consequence of categorizing, which just doesn't feel, it just feels very old world to me.
It is. I think it comes down to what people believe it means to be human. Like, what are people's stories around what the human experience actually is, in a sense of like competition, you know, limited resource, like if you don't control people it'll be absolute chaos. And that is a very common story. I feel like my dad's generation, like the men's workspace is kind of really changing that paradigm of like there's all these people in the same line of work, let's say they're all having you know, it's their livelihood, but they're all in communion at the same time. They're all sharing the space, but also like helping each other do that. And I have a conversation with my dad, and it's hard to get his head around of like, well, these people are doing that, like that's your competitor, you can't like. I'm like, no, I support them too, and I promote theirs. And yes, it's not sometimes easy when it's on the same day, on the same area, but it's like there isn't that same level, and he just couldn't get his head around that. So I think it does come back to like how do you see the world? I think conversations like this, like you, like change people's minds on that front, because the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be human are really how we then go forward and interact with others. So yeah, if you had limited resource, where would you take this? Where would you take Primal? Do you ever like thought experiment that, or like what you'd actually like? What do you have clarity on, like what would be the ideal to take Primal?
So I'll respond to what you just shared first, and then come back to this. No, this whole thing about competition, right? Like if you look at beech trees are extraordinary in the sense that like they basically redistribute resources to ensure the strength of the entire forest. So if you're a weaker beech tree that didn't gather enough sugar through photosynthesis in your leaves, once the trees that have an abundance of sugar will redistribute it to ensure that, you know, that you're okay. And they essentially act as a social security system. So a beech tree is only as strong really as its forest. And for me, beech trees, or that metaphor, is a really good example of inclusive societies. How do you treat your weaker counterparts? You know, how do you attend to your network, right? Instead of compete, this element of competition, which is also, I also feel is very antiquated, makes pretty much, I mean, whoever listens to this might have a completely different view, doesn't make so much sense to me, because we are ultimately much stronger together. I think the regeneration movement is different from, let's say, previous movements, especially ones that are, you know, mainly profit focused, in the sense that like we have this united goal, right, of wanting to put life at the center of our actions and our decisions, which means that a collective effort to shift mindsets is required. So anyone that might be deemed a competitor of Primal is actually a partner, right? You have Medicine Festival, you have Love Jam, you have Advaya, you have Earth. You know, maybe 20 years ago people would consider us competitors of each other's, but instead we're comrades, you know, collectively sharing, you know, attention and space on our different platforms to enable each other to support this growing movement that we know is desperately needed. And that is also regenerative, right? The sense of how can we work with, as opposed to being power over or power under each other, which has not been a very effective approach for the world and society.
Yeah, just on that, I often feel when you're out for a walk, or you're up a mountain and it's busy, like, sure, I get that. People don't like places to be busy, but I'm like, they're connecting with the same thing you're connecting with. So surely you've got so much in common with these people that why wouldn't you want them to be in the same space that you are? Because clearly you've got a lot in common with them. Same in the workspace. It's like, well, Advaya, doing things in a very similar way, speaking to similar language, similar like mission. And it's like, why would someone fear or like be scared of that when you're like, you've got so much in common and they're bolstering what you're doing? And depending on what it is, I think the more extractive stuff, rather than the more like giving and like the opposite of extraction, providing, strengthening, nourishing, like if it's in that sense, surely it makes more sense to be like doing this all together, because of course it makes more sense. There's more of you fighting this for the same thing.
Completely. Tony Robbins says, I forgot exactly how he said this line, but something about like, you're like, you know, your happiness is kind of in direct correlation to like what you're able to, like your capacity or your willingness or your wantingness to give, right? And my personal philosophy is like, if I can help, I want to support. We're supposed to be uplifting, and you know, whoever is on our ship, let's put it that way, on our team, like if we rise, everyone's rising with us, and that's, I think, the difference in providing or regenerative lens of the world, rather than, you know, an extractive one where I'm going to compete and win over those who are around me, and you know, they can fend for themselves. The fending for ourselves is what's gotten us into this challenge. We haven't been thinking about the living systems, the whole. You know, we have our social context, we have our environmental context, and of course you have your economic context. But they're nested systems; they're all interdependent, interrelated. So if we can have that sense of wholeness, right? How can we uplift? How can we mutually empower? How can we mutually reinforce? How can we, create a dialogue that enables and encourages everyone's voices to be heard? That is a mechanism. These are mechanisms that can support a more regenerative culture. Of course, much easier said than put into practice. But, you know, yourself and, you know, Zach, for example, or Nathan, or all these different players in the space, I think that's, you know, what we are promoting as a means and method of evolving the world that we wish.
Absolutely.
I think you asked me.
Yeah. You love answering the questions, making sure you do. Yeah, like the clarity aspect. There was one also thing, maybe it kind of feeds in, but like, do you have clarity on your future in terms of where you want to be and who you want to be around and what kind of things you want to be doing?
You mean with Primal?
Yes, Primal, but then maybe secondary, like just you, like. Yeah, I love asking that question.
Interesting. So in terms of thinking about how Primal will evolve, Primal has always been a very emergent project, in the sense of taking, you know, using nature as our teacher, about how you can have a plan, but with plans there needs to also be a sense of emergence, as in what is actually happening in the moment, and then how does that then re-inform and also adjust the plan. So I can share with you like a plan of sorts, with an asterisk that of course things could shift and change. The plan at the moment for Primal Gathering essentially is we're actually in the midst of creating a training program for people in different parts of the world, because you know, we get requests from Bogota, Colombia, New York and States, California, Germany, Spain, like different countries in the world asking, you know, when are we going to come? Wow. And our sense is those who live locally are probably better placed to create their own version of a Primal Gathering. That attends to their local needs, builds their own local database of landowners, regenerative experts, artisans, artists, etc. However, we have a cultural blueprint that requires training. It's not something you could just put in a handbook and send over an email. So that's a big part of the vision for the Primal Gathering space and place. So that we replicate essentially this model in other parts of the world to inspire just more tribes essentially to get to commune with the land. Yeah. And with Primal Leadership, what we've been working on actually at the moment is two things: building out programs of what does regenerative leadership look like in practice in more, let's say, corporate and organizational environments, which can be for NGOs, can be for, you know, SMEs, or maybe potentially also larger corporates, because if you're able to influence those in senior levels of, say, management and power in organizations with, you know, large numbers of people, and to emanate a culture of reciprocity, resilience, inclusion, cooperation, autonomy, through, of course, being inspired by the way that nature already operates to inform that design, we can create some really, my sense, monumental shifts in the way that we just even design our business models and our supply chains.
Sure.
So that's a big part of primal leadership, is to basically Trojan horse everything we've been doing with Primal Gathering into these environments, and also I'm working on at the moment a pilot of what does regenerative entrepreneurship look like for university students. So how can you basically permeate all these different systems through the inspiration of nature, and always including land regeneration element, because that is really really important. So that's where it is at the moment.
Beautiful. Makes a lot of sense. I've got to say, it really does. It really makes sense.
Yeah.
Things will shift and change, but that sounds like that will happen.
Yeah, and I mean we're trialing and testing all these things, and I'm lucky in the sense that I'm just learning so much about nature and how nature naturally operates, and then thinking about how to then apply those principles in practice in these different organizations. So it's a lot of trial and a lot of error. But it's fascinating and it's meaningful, and people feel really nourished by that experience. I just came back from Kent yesterday with Chippy and the whole crew. We did a 2-day offsite with a really cool company, small, 30 people, and the feedback is so positive. People feel like that they can hear each other, that they can like just be together. They have this deeper appreciation for nature, and you just realize like it's my hunger, my sense internally is like, wow, I just want the whole world to love nature as much as I do, and also just the people that we surround ourselves, like the Chippies, their fascination and adoration for, or the Valentinas for mushrooms, and the way that you can make food so beautiful but also so good for you, right? And that piece, that the curiosity piece, how do you inspire that curiosity and how do you infiltrate that curiosity across the board, is something that I'm very dedicated to and very passionate about. What does that mean for me? Interesting. Yeah, I noticed that my lens of thinking is often not through the lens of what it means for me personally. I often think from the space of how can we I always think from quite a mass space. It's macro. What are these macro changes that are required, and then how can I be of service to support those shifts and changes?
Almost the idea is carrying you, even when you have a brand and you have the imagery and the how that speaks to you and the messaging and the wording, it's kind of its own organism. It's an idea, but it's also this thing that you can share and agree on, and that can just take you in different places. It's like getting out your own way to support that. It's interesting.
Completely. I mean, I've always felt since the beginning of this project, I would actually argue that this project has been teaching me more than I have anything to do with the project, in the sense that every iteration of the Primal Gatherings or the Beast to the Flower or the offsites that we do, I'm just totally, I'm the student. I'm just watching and I'm observing, and then I'm iterating, and I'm so fortunate and lucky to be surrounded by such talented people who are so good at their thing. And I think maybe my personal role in that is just the weaving. It's just the curator, right? It's noticing and seeing that person would be really good in this formula of how we design a day.
Tapestry.
Yeah, to support the shift and change. I'm just the container, right? But the magic is really about the people who are there delivering the content. I don't have that level of expertise that Chippy has with mushrooms. I don't have the level of expertise that Faisal has with his ability to sing in that such extravagant and gorgeous way, or Zach Bush has, or Galahad Clark has about his shoes. These people hold those deep bellies of wisdom and knowledge. My role is just finding the space.
For sure, yeah. Also, like finding the people, but like the people that all those people you mentioned, that the one word is like effortless. It's like something comes through them that they're like, it's cheesy, but it's like born to do, or like born to be a part of something. They've just found the thing, and they're likely doing the same thing. They're just serving something that's they've found so much connection with. So yeah, amazing.
I would say this whole like serving thing and being an expression of, you know, in all the spaces that we've created, the authentic relating piece is deeply connected to the acceptance piece. Because if we create the right conditions to not only accept ourselves but accept others, then that also enables us to have the confidence and the courage to express who we are in our fullest being essence, you know, pick a word. And that enables courage to a degree that often people maybe don't feel as or have as easy access to in their day-to-day lives. But if we did have that, the power that we individually and collectively have when we access that level of inner truth, capacity to really express what we're sent, or in service to deliver and support and emanate and share. There's so much that can be done. And I think my secret not so secret web weaving of people and tapestry creating, as you put, in designing, you know, these programs of education or gatherings, is to allow for people to discover that power that's innate within them, and hopefully inspire them after the fact to go after it uninhibited, because the world needs that. And we need people in their power. We need people, you know, being able to take the risks and have the courage to say the hard things, to make the hard decisions in service of whatever it is that they are meant to be in service of. You know, whether it can be like nutrition, it could even be art, it can be music, it can be writing, it can be, you know, getting your hands dirty in the soil, it can be, you know, content creation, to your point. We all have something that we are serving, and when we're able to tap into that, so much beauty and awe can arise. And actually we are then filling our cups up in a way that we then have so much more to offer those around us and our environmental surroundings, because it's just joyous to do the thing that feels so organic and natural to you to do.
Beautiful. Great way to wrap it up. I do want to ask, all of that you just mentioned, what is the cost of that for you, like personally? What do you think the biggest cost of dedicating yourself to all of this?
Wow, what a question. Cost. Probably time. Yeah, time is definitely a huge resource that, you know, enables us to choose how we use it in whichever way. And being devoted to, you know, such a amazing but also, you know, big dream and I guess vision for the world requires, you know, me to step up and be in integrity with all that it is required to birth something like that into the world. That said, it's now getting to a space and a place where there are more holders who have their own visions of the project, and then able to also share that time with me in crafting and, you know, supporting its evolution. So time is definitely one of the, if you want to look at it as a cost, in the sense that I then have much less time to offer other things. And maybe also sometimes It could be also sometimes sleep.
3 things that you believe if people did, it would make a massive difference to ecology, their environment, their day-to-day, and what we need to see more of. And maybe I'll give you a first one, which might come back to like planting that thing in your garden. So what do you feel those 3 things, if you could get like a lot of people to do, what do you think? And there'd obviously be things that they could do, you know, that I could do tomorrow. I don't have a house, but you know.
So your framing of the question is something like external and action based.
Maybe not. I think as within, so without. So whatever is internal will affect the external. So maybe just some 3 pointers that you'd leave people with, that you're like encouraging, inviting them to participate in, to help. Because there are a lot of people out there who want to help. I think the biggest thing is knowing what is, with their limited time and resources, like what to spend that time doing. Like my thing would be to sit on the floor more, from a physical perspective, because I think sitting on the floor, it's the most like fundamental basic thing that we can do to help our health and longevity and strength and mobility and all sorts. But like from your standpoint of like ecology and like environment potentially.
So I'll say 3 things that might not immediately feel directly related to the environment, although in my experience they do contribute. The first is leaning in to discomfort and uncomfortable conversations and committing to reach understanding within those conversations.
Love that.
That enables intimacy, that enables community, and that enables a sense of feeling held, which is needed in order to feel safe, which will then contribute to our ability to look outwardly. The second thing in terms of thinking about ecology is, if you're curious, just start, whether that's joining a foraging walk, for example, or that's finding out where your local garden is. I know in Islington there's like local gardens where you can just pop up between Tuesday and Thursday. You don't even need to say anything, just to learn and help out. Feeding that curiosity on a micro scale will support the macro scale, because as you begin to learn about, say, the ecological world, you'll develop a deeper sense of love and kinship. And maybe, you know, if you have extra finances, for example, or resources, being able to then donate, you know, to these initiatives and projects, because for whatever reason, you could say, you know, even farmers, organic growers rather than industrial farmers, are maybe not incentivized as much through the lens of policy and government to actually, you know, grow their crops in a specific way, or in an organic, you know, holistic way. And so these projects depend on external funding to support their missions and aims. And so that's probably the third thing that I would share, which is, if you have, you know, extra resources at your disposal, and you cultivating and really learning to love your ecological surroundings through, you know, different activities, mushroom identification, listening to bird song, Sam Lee, you know, listening to nightingales, then, you know, offering up some, if it's a donation of time or a donation of resources to support these smaller, independent, local projects to do what they do, and they will feel the impacts, even if it's as, you know, minor as 20 or 50 quid, or 2 or 3 hours. It makes a really valuable and meaningful difference to the future of these projects, and we need these projects more than anything. And often some of these projects close down just because they just aren't able to finance the help that's required. Or you have people who are martyrs, who just who live on very meager resources because they're really thinking about, you know, the larger impact of their projects. And so those would be my 3 main things. And obviously Primal Gathering or Bees to the Flower initiative. If anyone's curious about learning something and just wants to come hang out for a day, we're doing these Bees to a Flower initiatives all over the country once a month, and it's good. It's good fun.
Great. Love those answers. Did not feel that they were going to be those answers, but it's great. It surprised me. Thank you so much. So much wisdom in this conversation. Really appreciate you. And I feel if anyone embodies those, I guess you mentioned around leadership, like what does leadership look like? And it's like self-leadership, but like coming back to you, like, are you an integrity? And those examples you give, like, that's what I definitely get from you. That coupled with the energy that you have with it, and the like playfulness, curiosity, coupled with like the energy that you imbue to all this stuff. Like, thank you, because I really think it. Yeah, you just are like a gatekeeper of all that stuff. So I appreciate you. Thank you for doing what you're doing, and spending that time on these projects, and commitment and discipline and all of it. So I appreciate it. Anything you want to leave us on, or where people can find you?
So people can find us on everything Primal Gathering related. So Instagram, Primal Gathering. I think Facebook as well, Primal Gathering. Our website is primalgathering.co, and our leadership work is on primalleadership.co. The only thing there's two things I'll leave people with.
Great.
The first is the courage to plant care in absolutely everything you do, even if you are faced with people, contexts, or situations that don't have the capacity to receive that level of care or love, because your planting of it will inspire, or can inspire, a necessary shift, even if you don't realize it. And the second is just deep gratitude for you and your not only joy at creating context for these conversations and determination, but commitment and consistency and discipline towards it, and also service in offering these honest sharings with the world. And I'm honoured and inspired by how professional the setup is, and I really can't wait to see how all of this also evolves in your timeline.
It is exciting when we collaborate, contribute to each other's kind of journeys. It's like I get so excited about what's to come for the other person. So I was like, well, who are you going to be in 5 years? I can't wait to meet that person. Because there's a lot, right? A lot in this country. And there was times in this country where I was like, nothing's going on here. I just don't connect with anything. And just like the envelope of the last year, connecting with so many people through these organisations, it's like there's so many people in this country doing phenomenal stuff. And like, how can we help, contribute to each other's missions? So it feels good. Thank you so much. I'll give you a hug.